They put him in the kitchen because they thought he couldn't aim. Then the bodies started piling up. To the high command, he was just a statistic, a man they claimed lacked the mental capacity to operate a sniper rifle fit only to scrub floors while the real soldiers went to war. They stripped him of his rank and dignity, laughing, as they sent him to the rear confident that he would never see combat. But when the jungle exploded and the unit was pinned down by an invisible enemy, the laughter died instantly. While the officers screamed in terror, paralyzed by the ambush, he was already calm, calculating wind, speed, and distance with the cold precision of a predator. They said he didn't know how to shoot, but in the next moments this black U.S. elite sniper was about to deliver a lesson in lethality that would leave the entire military in shock. The humidity in the mess hall was suffocating, a thick blanket of steam and stale grease that clung to his skin like a second uniform. But the heat of the kitchen was nothing compared to the slow-burning fire in his gut. While the rest of the platoon was out at the range, wasting ammunition and bragging about groupings they couldn't replicate in a firefight, he was here, peeling potatoes until his fingers were raw, treated as if his only value to the United States Army was his ability to scrub a pot. He was a ghost in his own unit, a man who had grown up tracking game through the dense backwoods where a single snapped twig meant going hungry. Yet here, thousands of miles from home, the brass refused to see him as a soldier. To them, the concept of a black U.S. elite sniper was a contradiction in terms, a biological impossibility according to the scientific racism spouted by the officers in the command tent. They looked at him and saw a laborer, a grunt fit for carrying crates or digging latrines, never a marksman capable of calculating windage, bullet drop, and the Coriolis effect in the split second before a heartbeat. Every request he had filed for a transfer to the Scouts sniper program had been lost or denied with a smirk, the paperwork shredded before the ink was even dry. The injustice wasn't just administrative. It was personal, a daily psychological warfare designed to break his spirit before he ever saw the enemy. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon under the scorching sun of the base perimeter. He had been assigned to clean the officers' latrines, a task given specifically to humiliate him after he was caught staring too long at a shipment of new M21 rifles. As he hauled the water buckets past the firing range, he stopped. The platoon's designated sniper, a loud-mouthed corporal named Miller, who owed his rank to his father's connections rather than his skill, was missing target after target at 400 yards. The rhythm was all wrong. Miller was jerking the trigger, breathing erratically, sweating panic into the stock of the weapon. The future black U.S. elite sniper stood there, the buckets heavy in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he mentally corrected Miller's aim. Just 2 clicks left. Wait for the gust to die down. Exhale. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his voice low but firm, suggesting that the corporal was fighting the rifle instead of letting it become an extension of his arm. The silence that followed was instant and terrifying. The firing line went dead. Lieutenant Vance, a man whose face was perpetually red with sunburn and disdain, slowly turned around, his boots crunching in the gravel as he marched over. He didn't look at the soldier's eyes. He looked at the mop bucket, then kicked it over, sending dirty water soaking into the soldier's boots. Vance got close enough that the soldier could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the time of day. He addressed the platoon, using the moment as a twisted educational theater. He told them that precision shooting, required a level of intellect and genetic temperament that people like him simply didn't possess. He claimed that their brains were wired for rhythm and labor, not the mathematical coldness of long-range warfare. The lieutenant laughed a dry, ugly sound and threw his own sidearm into the dirt at the soldier's feet, daring him to even touch it, mocking him by saying he wouldn't know how to disengage the safety. The soldier stood rigid, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth felt like they might shatter. Every instinct in his body screamed to pick up the weapon and prove them wrong, to show them that the Black Youth's elite sniper standing before them was the deadliest thing on this base. But he knew the game. If he touched that weapon, he would be court-martialed for insubordination. If he spoke, he would be thrown in the brig. So he swallowed the rage, tasting the metallic bitterness of blood where he had bitten his cheek, and picked up the bucket. The laughter of the platoon followed him all the way back to the kitchen, a chorus of mockery that burned hotter than the jungle sun. He wasn't a soldier to them. He was a joke. But war doesn't care about prejudice, and the enemy was closer than anyone realized. That night the humid air grew heavy, the usual cacophony of insects falling into an unsettling silence that the green officers failed to notice, but which made the hair on the back of the soldier's neck stand up. He was in the rear of the mess tent, scrubbing the final pot when the world disintegrated. The first mortar round didn't whistle. It just arrived with a concussive crack that lifted the tent flaps and shattered the light bulbs, plunging the base into chaos. Sirens wailed, cutting through the screams of the wounded. The soldier hit the floor, his instincts taking over, crawling through the debris toward the exit. Outside, the night was lit by the erratic flashes of tracer fire and the orange bloom of explosions. The perimeter had been breached. The Viet Cong sappers were inside the wire. It was a slaughter. He saw Lieutenant Vance running shirtless, screaming orders that nobody could hear, his face a mask of pure terror. The superior intellect he had bragged about was useless now. Panic had reduced him to a child. The soldier moved through the smoke like a phantom, unarmed, his eyes scanning for a weapon. He reached the sandbags near the command post just as a mortar round obliterated the sniper tower. He watched the body of Corporal Miller, the man who couldn't miss at the range, fall from the platform, lifeless before he hit the ground. The rifle, that beautiful, precision-tuned instrument of death, clattered onto the muddy earth, sliding to a halt just a few feet away from where the soldier was crouched. It was scratched, covered in mud, but the scope was intact. Around him, the defensive line was collapsing. Men were dying because they couldn't see where the enemy fire was coming from. The muzzle flashes from the jungle were suppressing the entire platoon. The officers were pinned, their heads buried in the dirt, praying for air support that wasn't coming. The soldier looked at the rifle. It was forbidden. Touching it was a crime. Using it was insubordination. But as he looked at the carnage, at the men being cut down, the kitchen staff, the latrine cleaners, the invisible men, he realized the rules didn't apply to dead men. The hesitation lasted a fraction of a second. He wasn't a cook. He wasn't a janitor. He lunged forward, his hand closing around the cold steel of the barrel. The Black U.S. elite sniper had finally entered the war. The RPD machine gun was a dragon-breathing fire from the edge of the tree line. Its rhythmic chug-chug-chug tearing through the sandbags and turning the muddy ground into a graveyard of flying dirt and shrapnel. Men were screaming, clutching shattered limbs, pressing their faces into the muck as the tracers cut a glowing scythe just inches above their helmets. Lieutenant Vance was curled in a fetal position behind a crate of rations, screaming into a dead radio handset, his face pale and slick with sweat, his authority dissolving with every burst of enemy fire. The platoon was pinned, effectively blind and dying by the second. In the middle of this hellscape, the soldier held the unauthorized M21 rifle, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a missing limb finally restored. He didn't drop into the standard prone position taught in basic training, nor did he use the sandbags that the enemy had already ranged and were currently pulverizing. Instead, he slid into a shallow depression of mud near the latrine runoff, a disgusting, stench-filled hollow that no officer would ever dignify with their presence, but which offered the only line of sight through the chaos. He ignored the screaming. He ignored the explosion. He went into the bubble, a state of hyper-focus he had learned not in boot camp, but in the deep woods of the South, tracking deer that could hear a twig snap from a mile away. He wiped the mud from the scope with his thumb, his movements deliberate and slow despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Through the lens, the world turned green and grainy, lit only by the strobe light flashes of the enemy muzzle. The distance was extreme, over 600 yards and low. Light a shot that the manual said was impossible without a spotter and daylight. But he wasn't shooting at a target. He was shooting at a rhythm. He watched the flash pattern of the machine gun. Flash, 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 pause. He timed his breathing to the enemy's cycle. He didn't use the skeletal support the drill sergeant screamed about. He wedged the rifle against a rotting stump, wrapping the sling around his forearm in a hunter's loop, a hillbilly trick that locked the weapon to his bone structure. The crosshairs settled on the darkness just behind the muzzle flash. He wasn't aiming for a torso. He was aiming for the shadow behind the gun shield. He waited for the space between heartbeats, that fraction of a second where the body is perfectly still. Exhale. The trigger break was crisp, a surprise that slammed the stock into his shoulder. The rifle barked, a distinct, sharp crack that sounded different from the chaotic spray of the M16s around him. Downrange, the effect was instantaneous. The rhythmic chugging of the RPD stopped mid-burst. The silence that followed was louder than the explosions had been. The enemy gunner didn't just stop firing. He had been erased. The bullet had threaded the needle, passing through the narrow slit of the gun shield and striking the operator, collapsing the entire enemy suppression element in a single second. The platoon, expecting the next wave of bullets, slowly lifted their heads from the dirt, eyes wide with confusion. The soldier in the mud didn't celebrate. He simply worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, which hissed as it hit the wet ground, and chambered another round, scanning for the loader. But the attack faltered. Without their heavy weapon, the Viet Cong assault crumbled, the shadows melting back into the jungle. Lieutenant Vance crawled out from behind the crates, his uniform soiled, his eyes darting around frantically. He looked at the silenced machine gun nest, then at the soldier rising from the latrine ditch with the sniper rifle in hand. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful for the officer to process. He marched over, snatching the rifle from the soldier's hand, nearly slipping in the mud. "You idiot!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking. "You could have killed us all. Who told you to touch this?" When a sergeant pointed out that the machine gun had stopped exactly when the cook fired, Vance scoffed, a desperate, nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Don't be stupid," Vance spat, wiping the scope with his sleeve. That was a mortar round, a stray mortar from the support battery, or pure dumb luck. Look at him. He's holding it like a shotgun. No discipline. He probably fired into the dirt and got lucky with a ricochet. The dismissal was absolute. The official report would credit a lucky mortar strike for saving the platoon. They sent him back to the kitchen, threatening a court-martial if he ever touched a weapon again. But out in the jungle, deep in the dark canopy where the enemy regrouped, the narrative was different. The Viet Cong commander examined the body of his gunner. There was no shrapnel, no explosion burns, just a single clean hole right through the center of the forehead. He knew this wasn't luck. He knew the Americans had brought a demon to the battlefield. He turned to his radio operator and issued a new order, calling off the assault troops and requesting the Cobras, the elite counter-sniper teams. They thought they were fighting a battalion, but they were hunting one man, and the black U.S. elite sniper was just getting started. The sun went down, and the soldier ceased to exist, fading into the shadows of the perimeter, not as a man, but as a phantom. By day, he was the invisible laborer, head down, scrubbing the grease from the oversized stew pots, while Lieutenant Vance made loud, derogatory jokes about his intelligence. But as the camp fell into an uneasy sleep, drugged by exhaustion and the relentless humidity, the kitchen hand transformed into the most lethal asset in the sector. He had cached the rifle, the same M21 he had borrowed during the ambush, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath the floorboards of the supply shed, a secret that could get him court-martialed for treason. But the black U.S. elite sniper wasn't fighting for the approval of men who hated him. He was fighting for the survival of the boys who didn't know they were being hunted. He slipped through the wire, moving with a fluid grace that defied the heavy boots he wore. His body painted with a mixture of charcoal and mud that made him one with the jungle rot. He wasn't following orders. He was hunting the hunters. The enemy had sent their best, the Cobras, elite counter-snipers trained to pick off. American officers, and the base was bleeding out, one lieutenant at a time. The official strategy was to call in airstrikes that hit nothing but trees. But he had a different plan. A tactic born from the desperation of poverty and the ingenuity of survival. He didn't just bring a rifle. He brought trash. In his pockets, he carried a bizarre assortment of scavenged items, empty sea ration cans, a spool of fishing line, and a handful of jagged metal scraps polished to a mirror shine. The officers would have called it garbage. He called it bait. Deep in the green hell of the jungle, 2 miles outside the wire, he found his kill zone, a ridge overlooking the trail networks used by the Viet Cong trackers. He knew the enemy snipers were disciplined, patient, and waiting for the glint of a scope or the silhouette of a helmet, so he gave them exactly what they wanted. He rigged a puppet 50 yards to his left, a stick, propped up with a helmet he had salvaged from the trash heap, and the piece of polished metal angled perfectly to catch the sliver of moonlight filtering through the canopy. He tied the fishing line to the rig and retreated to his actual hide, a hollowed-out root system covered in ferns. He waited. Hours passed. The jungle breathed around him, insects crawling over his skin, but he didn't flinch. He was a statue carved from obsidian. Then he tugged the line. The helmet shifted. The metal flashed, mimicking the glint of a sniper scope, adjusting its focus. The reaction was instantaneous. A single shot cracked from the dense foliage 300 yards across the valley, a perfect shot that punched a hole through the empty helmet of his decoy. The enemy sniper had taken the bait, revealing his position with the muzzle flash. That was the mistake. The black U.S. elite sniper didn't hesitate. He had already ranged the area. He exhaled, his heart rate dropping to a resting beats per minute that would worry a doctor, and squeezed the trigger. The N-21 bucked. There was no need to check the kill. He heard the wet thud of a body falling from a tree platform, one cobra down, but he didn't return to base. He moved, shoot, and move. He set up again, miles away, using a different trick, this time using the co-ration cans to mimic the sound of a careless soldier reloading. Another enemy shadow moved to investigate. Another single shot rang out. By the time the sun began to bleed purple into the eastern sky, he had engaged 5 targets and expended 5 rounds. He slipped back into the base just as the morning mist rolled in, cleaning the rifle and burying it before the first bugle call, washing the charcoal from his face to resume his role as the slow kitchen worker. The next morning, the radio traffic was chaotic. Patrols had found the bodies. 5 high-ranking North Vietnamese marksmen, the terror of the region, found dead with terrifying precision. The official reports at the command tent were baffled. Intelligence officers argued over the data. They speculated that a Navy SEAL team must be operating in the area without their knowledge, or perhaps a ghost squad of Rangers. "No regular infantryman shoots like this," the colonel declared, slamming his fist on the map table. "These are headshots at 400 yards in low light. Whoever is doing this is a master." They looked right past the man pouring their coffee, the man whose hands were still steady from the night's work. The irony was suffocating. They praised the phantom of the valley, creating a legend around a savior they refused to believe could be black, but the enemy knew. The captured radio transmissions spoke of a spirit that walked through Claymore mines and saw in the dark. The fear factor was shifting. The Viet Cong patrols became hesitant. The constant harassing fire on the base stopped because the enemy gunners were too afraid to open their shutters. The Black U.S. elite sniper had single-handedly achieved air superiority from the ground. However, the perfection of his work began to draw the wrong kind of attention. Colonel Strickland, a man who cared more about regulations than results, noticed the discrepancies in the ammunition inventory. Rounds were missing. Not crates, but specific match-grade cartridges. And there were reports of a figure breaching the perimeter wire at odd hours. Strickland didn't see a hero. He saw a rogue element, a drug runner or a traitor. He didn't suspect the kitchen staff. He suspected one of his own dissatisfied lieutenants. He ordered a lockdown. He ordered night vision surveillance of the perimeter, not to catch the enemy, but to catch the insubordinate coward sneaking out. The net was closing in. That night, as the soldier prepared to slip out to hunt a heavy mortar team that had been setting up on the ridge, he stopped. He saw the gleam of a fresh tripwire near his exit point. It wasn't a VC trap. It was U.S. issue. They were hunting him. The Black U.S. elite sniper realized with a sinking feeling that his greatest threat wasn't the enemy in the jungle, but the chain of command that would rather court-martial a black man for breaking rules than thank him for saving their lives. He had to make a choice, stay in the kitchen and let the mortar team kill his platoon, or step into the trap, take the shot, and face the consequences. He tightened his bootlaces, grabbed the rifle, and stepped over the wire. The mission came first. The trap Colonel Strickland had set for the insubordinate was rendered instantly irrelevant by the roar of the apocalypse. As the mortar team the sniper had intended to hunt unleashed a barrage that turned the command post into a crater of burning canvas and twisted metal. This was not a probe. It was an annihilation wave. The perimeter fence, already weakened, evaporated under the blasts of satchel charges, and the enemy poured through the breach like a muddy, screaming flood. The discipline of the base collapsed in seconds. Men ran blindly into the dark. Officers shouted conflicting orders that were swallowed by the din of a K-47 fire and the scent of cordite mixed with the copper tang of blood. Lieutenant Vance, the man who had mocked the sniper's intellect, was caught in the open, stunned by a concussion grenade, clutching a wounded arm as the defensive line disintegrated around him. The base was lost. The flag was as good as burned. But the black U.S. elite sniper did not run. In the midst of the rout, he moved against the flow of retreating soldiers, sprinting toward the only position that offered a field of fire, the burning skeleton of the water tower, a suicide post that was currently the target of every enemy gunner in the sector. He ascended the ladder 2 rungs at a time, bullets pinging off the metal struts like angry hornets, and threw himself onto the scorching platform. Below him, the battle was a confused swirl of shadows, but from his vantage point, the chaos organized itself into a target-rich environment. He didn't just fire. He conducted a symphony of destruction. He shouldered the M21, the barrel hot enough to blister skin, and began to work the bolt with a speed that defied mechanism. He didn't target random soldiers. He dismantled the enemy's command structure. First, the radio operator calling in the mortar, strikes headshot. Second, the squad leader blowing the whistle for the charge chest shot. Third, the heavy machine gunner setting up on the mess hall steps double tap. The rhythm was hypnotic. Crack thump, crack thump. The sniper was no longer hiding his talent. He was broadcasting it to the world. He began to shout orders down to the terrified privates, cowering behind the sandbags, his voice booming with a tactical authority that cut through the panic. He called out sectors of fire, corrected the aim of the surviving mortar crews by eye, and anticipated the enemy's flanking maneuvers before they even happened. The simple laborer was outthinking the entire North Vietnamese battalion. Then came the moment that would haunt Lieutenant Vance for the rest of his life. The lieutenant was crawling through the mud, his pistol empty, staring up at the terrifying sight of 3 enemy soldiers rushing him with bayonets fixed, screaming a war cry of inevitable death. Vance squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the cold steel to pierce his chest. Crack, crack, crack. 3 distinct shots rang out in less than 2 seconds. The weight of a falling body slammed into Vance's legs. He opened his eyes, gasping for air, to see the 3 enemy soldiers dead in a heap just feet from him, each with a precision wound to the center mass. Slowly terrified, Vance looked up toward the burning tower. The smoke cleared for a brief second, illuminated by a flare, and he saw him. The cook, the man he had ridiculed, the man he had deemed unfit to hold a rifle, was standing like a god of war amidst the flames, working the bolt for the next target. The look on Vance's face wasn't just relief. It was the shattering of his entire worldview. The realization that the savior of the battalion was the very man he had tried to break hit him with the force of a physical blow. The enemy advance faltered. They were losing officers faster than they could replace them. The momentum of the assault broke against the rock of one man's accuracy. But then the rifle clicked dry. The sniper reached for a magazine, but his pouches were empty. He had fired every round. The enemy, sensing the silence from the tower, prepared to surge one last time. The sniper stood up, drawing his standard-issue 1911 pistol, ready to die fighting. But the surge never came. The enemy soldiers looked up at the silhouette against the fire, the man who had decimated their leadership in minutes, and they felt a primal fear. They didn't see a soldier. They saw a myth. A cry went up from the Vietnamese lines, a name that would be whispered in their camps for years. The Black Demon, Overcome by the supernatural terror of a marksman who seemingly couldn't miss and couldn't be killed, the enemy commanders blew the retreat. They turned and ran back into the jungle, leaving the burning base behind, not because they were outgunned, but because they were terrified of the man in the tower. The sniper stood alone, the empty rifle smoking in his hand, watching the jungle swallow the threat as the stunned silence of his own platoon finally settled over the ruins. Dawn broke over the fire base, not with the chirping of birds, but with the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard, the air thick with the smell of wet ash and death. The sun illuminated a landscape that defied military logic. The perimeter was shattered, the sandbags were pulverized, and the scorch marks of mortar fire pockmarked the earth like craters on the moon. Yet the American flag still snapped in the breeze above the ruined command post. Colonel Strickland arrived by chopper at 0800 hours, his boots hitting the mud with the heavy thud of authority, expecting to find a massacre of his own men, ready to write the letters home to grieving mothers. Instead, he found a forensic nightmare that no manual could explain. As he walked the perimeter with the grave registration units, the colonel's face went from grim to pale. They found the enemy bodies not in the random, scattered clusters of a suppressed infantry assault, but in a terrifyingly specific pattern. There were dozens of them draped over logs, slumped in foxholes, or frozen in the act of climbing the wire. The medic tagging the bodies looked up at the colonel, his hands shaking as he held up a clipboard. "Sir," the medic whispered, "I don't understand. There are no chest wounds from shrapnel, no spray and pray, every single one of them. It's a head shot, or a heart shot. The entry wounds are identical." Strickland pushed past the medic and knelt beside a fallen North Vietnamese captain. The hole in the officer's helmet was a dark, perfect circle, the geometric center of the forehead. He walked 50 yards to the next body, a radio operator, and found the same impossibility. He looked back at the burnt-out skeleton of the water tower 400 yards away and did the mental math. It wasn't just difficult. It was a ballistic miracle. "Get me the ballistics report," Strickland barked, his voice tight. When the armorer returned, he looked like he had seen a ghost. "Sir, we pulled the rounds. They're all 7.62 match grade. They all came from the same barrel. One rifle, one shooter. 53 confirmed kills in under 40 minutes. The realization hit the command group like a physical blow. They hadn't been saved by air support. They hadn't been saved by a counterattack. They had been saved by a single man who had stood in the fire and delivered death with the consistency of a machine. The colonel demanded to see the hero, expecting a ranger, a Green Beret, or perhaps a visiting instructor. Instead, Lieutenant Vance, arm in a sling and eyes downcast, pointed toward the mess tent. The summons was not a parade. It was a march to the gallows. The soldier was pulled from the line where he was serving powdered eggs to the survivors, his uniform still stained with the grease of the kitchen and the soot of the battle. He marched into the command tent, flanked by MPs, his expression unreadable, a stone mask of stoicism. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The M21 sniper rifle lay on the colonel's table, cleaned and reassembled, looking like an accusation. Strickland sat behind the desk. Vance stood to the side, unable to meet the soldier's eyes. There was no applause. There was only the heavy weight of a hierarchy that had been shattered. Strickland picked up the rifle, feeling its weight, looking for a defect, looking for an excuse. "You violated direct orders," Strickland began, his voice low. "You misappropriated government property. You endangered the chain of command." The soldier stood at attention, silent. But Strickland continued, tossing the file onto the desk. "The ballistics don't lie. You saved this battalion. My intelligence officers tell me you eliminated the entire regional command structure of the NVA in one night." The colonel leaned forward, the question burning in his eyes, the same question that was eating at every officer in the room who had spent years at West Point studying warfare. "Private, your file says you have an 8th grade education. It says you're a cook. Officers said you didn't know how to shoot, that you lacked the cognitive ability for ballistics. Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? Who trained you? The Marines? The agency?" The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. The black U.S. elite sniper looked at the colonel, then at Vance, his eyes clear and devoid of arrogance, carrying the weight of generations of survival. "No, sir," he said, his voice calm and deep. "I didn't go to your schools. Back home, ammunition costs money we didn't have. The squirrels don't stand still, and the deer don't give you a second chance. If I missed, my family didn't eat that night. I didn't learn for medals, sir. I learned so I wouldn't starve." The simplicity of the answer crushed the ego of every man in the room. It wasn't tactical genius derived from a textbook. It was the raw, undeniable competence of a man forged by necessity, a skill honed in a world they were too privileged to understand. Strickland sat back, speechless. There was no court-martial. The paperwork was buried, the theft of the rifle redacted from the logs. They couldn't give him the Medal of Honor. The politics of the time and the embarrassment of the officers involved wouldn't allow it. But they couldn't send him back to the kitchen. He was quietly transferred to a specialized unit, a long-range reconnaissance team that existed only on paper, where his talents were finally unleashed without the leash of bigotry. As he walked out of the tent, Lieutenant Vance finally looked up, offering a clumsy, hesitant salute, not to the rank, but to the man. The soldier nodded once, picked up his gear, and walked back out into the humidity of the jungle. He remained a ghost, his name absent from the history books, but in the hushed conversations of the veterans who survived that night, the legend lived on. They knew who had saved them. They knew that when the world said he was nothing, the Black U.S. elite sniper proved he was everything.